Well, hello everyone. I'm James Peat Barbieri, and today we will have a conversation with friends of the Pari Center with Shantena Augusto Sabbadini. Shantena has been our director here at the Pari Center since 2017 and has been our associate for over 15 years. Hello, Shantena.
Hi, James. Glad to meet you here.
Would you talk a bit about your background?
I was born during the war, World War II, and spent the first couple of years on the Lake Como, in a house on the Lake Como. My father was a Jew, and he had to escape. And I was living with my mother, who was very worried about me. She was not Jewish and not officially married to my father, but quite worried. But for me, it was paradise, actually, because I was in this garden with big trees and free to run around. And it became everything much more difficult when, after the end of the war, we went back to Milan and I had to go to school, and a whole other world started happening for me. It would be a long story to make the whole story of my life, but I studied physics in Milan and worked on the quantum measurement problem, which essentially is fascinating work that got very personally involved in, and I think I did good work at the time. I went to California in 1971, and it was a very fertile ground and a very interesting time in those years in California. And it was like a great process of discovery and expansion. And I felt very close to many friends at that time and to the dream we had of changing the world. I was spending my days in the physics department of the University of California, Santa Barbara. But then I would go home to my teepee and spend time with my friends in a hippie community. So it was a very rich time, I would say, challenging time and rich time. In the physics part, I was working on the first identification of a black hole. That was the exciting problem in astrophysics at the time. People had identified in the constellation of the Swan, in the Cygnus X1, an X-ray source, which many elements pointed to as a possible black hole. So Jim Hartle was my professor at the time, and I worked on that identification, which was also a way to approach, from the science point of view, many interesting questions, like what is time, what is space, and eventually this also coming from my Milan work on the quantum measurement problem, what's mind and what's matter. So when after I came back from the States, I was rather disillusioned by academia. I was already in the States because we were working on all these interesting problems, but some of the professors there were turning those interesting problems into bombs that were used in Vietnam. So the involvement of the scientific with the military establishment was a very disturbing fact for me. At the same time, I was opening up to this like more spiritual way of looking at things and was more interested in human interaction than in scientific understanding. So when I came back from California with a bunch of friends, we started a commune in the countryside and started growing organic food and meditating together and living together. And it was still part of this dream of changing the world. That went on for a few years, and that then it eventually also changed. And I, for some time, was involved in a publishing house, traveling around the world and translating books, and eventually connected with a center in Switzerland, Eranos, which had been created by a Dutch woman and C.G. Jung in the 30s, and had been really a beacon of high-level work in dimensions like history of religions, myth, psychic research. Jung was a crucial person of that environment. All this was many years before, was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and I arrived at Eranos in 91. So there are a few places in my life that when I arrived there, I felt like, wow, there's something happening here for me. And Santa Barbara, California was definitely one of those places. But then also the place in Tuscany where we started the commune, that it was an experience like that. And Eranos was an experience like that. And the Pari Center was an experience like that. As if like something in the aura of the place, like catches you and says, hey, I have a gift for you. Stop here. So yes, Eranos was a place like that. And after Eranos, the next significant revolution for me was the Pari Center.
So one aspect of your career that stands out to me is your relationship with Taoism. How did you encounter this philosophy and how did it affect your worldview?
I first encountered Eastern thought through Buddhism. And it was like the first reference frame to understand spiritual experiences. Some spiritual experiences that I had and was not able to make sense of at the time. Particularly one Satori experience I had in Mexico, when after going through a powerful personal crisis, then suddenly I went into a space of absolute peace and bliss and an incredible sense of joy, which at the time made no sense to me, but that was undoubtedly there. So I was at the time very rational and very identified with the scientific mind. But during that time, like this other dimension opened up. The realization that we are part of a big mystery. and our scientific understanding of it is only a minute fraction of reality. Um, so Eastern thought came in to help me to make sense of it. And it wasn't Taoism at first, but Taoism came in through the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu's book. And the meeting with Lao Tzu was like meeting a master, even though a master who had died 25 centuries before, but with whom I felt a very intimate connection. And I'm not a Taoist, and I don't practice Taoism. I don't have any connection with the Taoist community. It's a very personal affair with Lao Tzu. And yes.
So this journey that you've had also brought you to Eranos and to the translation of books like I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. Would you tell us a little bit about what Eranos is and your involvement in the center?
Yeah, Eranos is a center that was founded in the 1930s by Olga Fröbe, a Dutch woman, and Carl Gustav Jung, as a place of East-West dialogue. Europe was waking up to this dimension of the dialogue with the East and developing, on the one hand, like a whole esoteric side in the West, and discovering like Tibetan Buddhism, and Jung was deeply studying archetypes and images of the psyche. Eranos was born as a place of integration of all this understanding. Was started in the 1930s, had its great period, its apex in around 1950, 1960, when like the torchbearer of European intellectual work on this type of topics gathered every year at Eranos. So it was an exceptional meeting place. And it was still an exceptional meeting place many years later when I arrived there. All the great people of the top years of Eranos had died before, but Eranos was still like a place of excellent work, and beside being a great place of research, it was a very convivial space. It was a space where some of the most interesting conversations happened at night in the kitchen with a bottle of wine in a lovely place. It's like 3 old houses on the shore of the Lago Maggiore, the Swiss part of the Lago Maggiore. And Jung and many people after him would wake up in the morning and jump into the lake. So Eranos had this multiple dimensions of this serious scholarly work and a bit of craziness, a bit of playfulness, and very important, intimate contact between people, a place of friendships, like the Pari Center. Actually, it's like from Eranos, the next big reference point for me. At Eranos, I was working on mainly on the translation of the I Ching, together with Rudolf Ritzema, who was the director of the center at the time, and became a close friend.
Talking about Eranos, one thing that I have found is the headstone to Il Genio Ignoto, the unknown genius. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's a nice little monument in the garden of Eranos, which was put there by Olga Fröbe and Jung. They asked a friend sculptor to create it as a homage to what they called the unknown genius of the place, because they felt that there was the support for their work was coming from a local spirit, a spirit of the place. So there's this nice little monument which has the image is like an hourglass, like two triangles touching with the tip. And with Rudolf, we use that as a symbol for the process of asking questions to the I Ching. And that the upper triangle means like you take all your complex situation and you focus it down to a point. That's your question to the I Ching. And then the answer of the I Ching opens up in the lower triangle. Behind that monument, there are the ashes of Olga Fröbe.
So you've mentioned the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. Would you like to share with us your relationship with the two books, but also the process of the translation, as you've translated both books in Italian and English?
The work with the I Ching came first, and came like I went to Eranos in the early 90s, 91. And started working with Rudolf Ritzema, who was then the director of Eranos, on the Italian translation of the I Ching. Rudolf had created his own concept of a translation of the I Ching. And the intention was that the images that the book conveys would be directly accessible to the reader, not through the interpretation of a translator. The I Ching is a very old book. It's as a written text is almost 3,000 years old, and as an oral text is even older than that. And the Chinese of the I Ching is very ancient and not as structured as more recent classical Chinese, or even more so than modern Chinese. So that the words are like kind of islands of an archipelago, or images flashing from a dream. And the intention of our translation was to give all the possible nuances of those terms to the reader and allow the reader to create his or her own translation, so to speak, from the raw material. So this was Rudolph's idea, and I joined him, and working with him, I learned how to work with old Chinese texts, so that later on, eventually, I applied that skill to the translation of the Tao Te Ching, which was my beloved book.
Now, after Eranos, which is a center close to you, I guess you moved on towards the Pari Center.
That's yes.
How did you come to meet David Peat, the founder of the center, and what attracted you to it?
Right, yeah. that was another little piece of magic, another of those situations in which an environment speaks. And I was familiar with David Peat's books long before I was familiar with him. For a few years before going to Eranos, I was working for a publishing house in Italy. And one of my jobs was reading books and discussing them for publication. So I met various books by David Peat. I'm particularly remembering in this moment this beautiful illustrated book which is called The Turbulent Mirror, on chaos theory. And the genius spirit of David was very much in those books. But to me, David could be anywhere in the world, in Canada, in the States, or in the UK. So what was my surprise when I looked him up on the internet and discovered that he was half an hour away from me. I was living in Tuscany at the time, and Pari was just half an hour away. So of course I called him and came to visit. And I still remember very vividly that first visit. We sat out on the balcony in the back of David and Maureen's house. A very small balcony. There was like barely enough space for 2 chairs. And at first, my interest was, okay, finally somebody I can talk physics with. And I was mostly excited about talking about physics with David. But I soon discovered that this was just one of his interests. It had been very important in his life at various stages, and certainly the contact with Bohm and the exchange with Bohm would be like crucial. But his interest was much wider. It was about human affairs in general, and about thought, art, spirituality. So we soon found that we were connecting in many places, in many ways, and was the beginning of first visiting various times, participating in the activities, and eventually getting involved with David practically in all the activity of Pari. And also sometimes in running courses elsewhere. A few times David and I traveled together and went and teach in other places. One time I invited David to come, when I was still involved with Eranos, to come and speak at Eranos. And he started, took a train to come up to Switzerland, to Eranos. But in Milan, he switched to the wrong train, going back south. So when I called him and asked him, David, we're waiting for you here, he said, nah.
Got the train back. And how you met David, my granddad? It looks very, he would call it the synchronicity that you just lived around the corner. But another synchronicity was, when he died, when you arrived the day of his death from Cordoba. which I thought it was very, passing the torch in a sort of way, as now you're director of the Pari Center and you're actively involved in all of our projects.
That day, the day that David died, is also very clear in my memory. Just the day when we met on that little terrace, and the wake for him in Eleanor's room with all the family there, and with David there with us, was such a special moment. It was as if David was enjoying it, and it had like such a normal, easy, loving atmosphere that real magic was happening there.
Well, going back to the center, what ideas are you promoting via the Pari Center?
Well, for one thing, I think an idea that the Pari Center is conveying and that I'd like to support is that there is no separation between science and spirituality. The same inquiry is present in both. And the same fundamental questions, the core of the scientific endeavor is not the practical usefulness of it. That's kind of a byproduct of it, even though that byproduct has become so important as to be perceived as dominant. But it's like the same fundamental questions. Who are we? What is mind? What is matter? What is consciousness? Where does all this come from? So I think one role of the Pari Center is bringing these dimensions together. Another aspect, I think, which I consider as very crucial in the Pari Center, is this quality that, talking about Eranos, I've called it the convivial quality that's very much there also in the Pari Center. So that the search for truth, or the search for understanding, it's not a cold intellectual affair, but it's a human passion. It's something we can share and rejoice with and play with. And David had very strong this quality of playfulness. And one of his main way to teach was through playfulness.
Yes. Well, as we all know, the people who have been to the Pari Center, the conference doesn't stop in the classroom. We share our own meals together. We from morning to evening we're always together, and once a conference we all go out and dance, and you are always on the dance floor. So yes, I think you're right. It does have that convivial, familiar sort of atmosphere that the Pari Center.
And also, I think another thing that the Pari Center is conveying in a very fundamental way is the relationship with nature. And being in the village of Pari, which has all this past and to some extent present with agriculture and with the natural cycles and a collaborative relationship with the earth. David used to talk about human beings as midwives to nature. So I think that's another key message of the Pari Center. It's this sense of love and respect for nature.
Your latest book, Pilgrimages to Emptiness, Rethinking Reality Through Quantum Physics, in your own words, is an invitation to recover the sense of wonder for the immensity of existence. Would you give us a quick summary of what the book is about?
Well, yeah, that's what it is about. It's about wonder, actually. It's about like science as an instrument of wonder. It's like we push science, we push understanding through science, through the scientific method, as far as we can. And by doing that, we really come in touch with the immensity of what we don't understand and what's beyond it. So it's like pushing on the edge of mystery. And the intention of the book is to communicate the joy of that, and the wonder and the surprise. We need the rigorous approach of science, not to stop there, but to understand the complexity, the richness, the subtlety of the mystery. Einstein used to say that God is subtle. Yeah.
In this book, you deal with some big and important philosophical and physical questions in a very clear and simple way. Big questions that you ask are the unity of mind and matter, determinism and freedom, and space and time. But with your experience, and also in regards to the book, where is the meeting point of physics, such as cosmology and the quantum world, with the spiritual Taoism?
I think one important point of contact is the sense of oneness. It's like we encounter it in physics and cosmology. All the reality which appears to us as separate objects. When you dive to a deeper level, it's just superposition of infinitely extended fields. So science brings us to the edge of this sense of oneness of everything. We're not isolated. We're not separate being. We're part of the whole. And I think Tao's, like Buddhism, but also like mystical Christianity, has this sense of wholeness. Or Baruch Spinoza, who was saying like, God sive natura, Deus sive natura. This, once again, it's exploring what's beyond the apparent separation of our existence. All the reality which appears to us as separate object. When you dive to a deeper level, it's just superposition of infinitely extended fields. So science brings us sense of oneness of everything. We're not isolated. We're not separate being. We're part of the whole. And I think Taoism, like Buddhist, but also like mystical Christianity, has this sense of wholeness. Or Baruch Spinoza, who was saying like, God sive natura, Deus sive natura. This, once again, it's exploring what's beyond the apparent separation of our existence.
Thank you very much, Shantena, for your words and your contributions to our center. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you soon at our next conversations with friends of the Pari Center.
Thank you very much, James.